Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? It's exciting for me to be here in front of you. Just some logistics. Please, a reminder to just keep the questions coming in as the conversation goes. I will leave about 10, 15 minutes at the end for some questions from the audience. And so I'll be getting that in my tablet, and so I'll be asking those. So please do get those questions in. And so I'm very excited to be here in front of you today to speak on a topic that I'm very passionate about. I think we're all aware of the rich cultural diversity that we have on the continent. And so thinking about leadership and some of the leadership principles that are important to navigate some of these landscapes is super important. In fact, about 10 years ago, I remember watching an interview of a man that I've come to admire quite a lot in that time, Patrick Aouda, who I'm sure some of you will know. He founded Ashesi University, and he said, the question of transformation in Africa is actually a question of leadership. And so I feel like there's no better way or no better place to start the conversation today, and as well as with a guest speaker who has accomplished so much in her career. And so I'm excited to learn about some of the leadership principles from our guest speaker, the challenges and opportunities from the African context, as well as explore some of what that looks like within the financial services sector, but also exploring some other sectors that she's particularly interested in. And so thank you so much, Mishola David, for making the time to be here with us today. I'm sure all of you have read her bio, and so I'm going to give you a quick intro on who she is. Mishola has achieved so much professionally, and in fact, even just coming here, one of my colleagues shamelessly plugged that his mother worked under Mishola and was one of the most influential people that she's worked with. And so it's an incredible honor to have you here, and you're an inspiration to not just a lot of people back home, but also a lot of people abroad. She served as the chief executive of Africa regions of Standard Bank Group and was responsible for 19 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. She's also an astute board leader and has sat on various boards, including former vice chairman of Nigerian Economic Summit Group, former chairman of Stanbic IBTC Bank. She currently sits as a non-executive director of Stanbic, as well as an independent non-executive director of Coca-Cola HBC. Ms. Shola was named Businesswoman of the Year in 2016 by CNBC All Africa. And as if all of that is not enough, she is currently a PhD candidate at the University of London. And so, with that, I want to start, maybe not necessarily going straight into the thick of the conversation, but you're clearly someone who has accomplished so much in your career. I'd love to hear how you do it, how you continuously pursue long life learning, and what role that has played in your career.
Thanks very much, Kennedy, and thanks for having me. It's a great privilege to be here in such a great university, as the Dean has clearly stated. I think it's important to be what Microsoft CE says, a learn it all. You know, you just have to keep on learning. And I found that that is what has helped me along my career, in just an attitude of wanting to learn. And you can learn from everybody, your colleagues, your direct reports, your bosses. And when I left Standard Bank, I decided to pursue a PhD because I wanted to learn more. And once I started, I realized how little I know. So, lifelong learning is a very important attribute for a leader.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think growing up in South Africa, we're not. We have a tremendous amount of Mandela quotes that we live by, and one that resonates quite deeply is, "Education is the most powerful weapon in which you can use to change the world," and it's often synonymous, this growth mindset, with a lot of leaders, and so it's great to see that. But if we had to take it a little bit way back, I want to start a long time ago in which you were growing up in Accra, daughter of diplomats, and you were exposed to a diverse set of cultures and environments from a young age. I'm wondering how these formative years and experiences shaped your approach to leadership.
Thanks for that. I mean, living in another country, attending an international school, watching my parents entertain, guests practically every evening from different countries really helped to expose me to diversity. And I think that prepared me for working in diverse teams, in different countries, different environments, different cultures. And I remember when I finished my MBA and went back to Nigeria to work, and I was interviewing for graduate trainee roles. And I went to this bank, and they were all speaking in one local language. And when they gave me an offer, I refused because I found I couldn't work in a monocultural environment. I didn't feel comfortable in a monocultural environment. So I think certainly those early years have shaped and prepared me for diversity.
Have you found that your leadership style changes with different nationalities or cultures across Africa?
Well, there are differences across the continent. So in Southern Africa, the approach is non-confrontational. So many times you've got to really make sure that people agree with what you want to do, because they might not agree but not tell you they don't agree. Yeah. I think in South Africa particularly, there's a lot of political correctness, and I think it's partly due to the history. In West Africa, particularly in Nigeria, where I come from, it's very direct, very... you're left in no doubt as to what everybody thinks. And I know, many times my South African colleagues would actually be quite alarmed at, the arguments and discussions that take place. I think East Africa is somewhere in between, and, not as aggressive and direct as a Nigerian, but would be clear as to what they're saying. So you kind of adapt, to the different leadership styles. And the most important thing is finding those areas where you agree on, those common areas, and then sort of moving forward with your decisions.
Yeah, that's incredible to hear. Some personal experience with that this year, co-chairing the Africa Alliance, in which I have a team of very fierce Nigerian women. And I will get calls throughout the night, in the morning, and dealing with a lot of directness. And but what's incredible is to see the ability to still get things done, and get things done the goal never shifts, and that's good to hear. And fast forward a few years as you started thinking through your career, curious to know what the vision of the future you had, and how that played out, and if there were any specific pivotal moments in your career that sort of shaped your journey. I'm sure you have a ton of fascinating tales to tell, and so if you could expand on any that sort of stand out, that would be fantastic.
Sure. I always wanted to pursue a career in banking, and I've spent my entire career working in banks. And I started out in a bank called Now Merchant Bank, which at the time was affiliated to American Express. And I basically, learned as much as I could about banking. The first pivotal moment I will talk about was when I moved across with my boss and a few other people to set up a new bank, a new investment bank. And it was a very exciting time. It was very entrepreneurial because, we were there from the beginning, buying furniture, writing policies, looking for clients. It really sort of helped me in terms of shaping my ability to grow a business from scratch. The second pivotal moment I will talk about is when the regulator decided to raise the capital base of banks more than fivefold, to something like $200 million. And we then had to go into a series of mergers, which was quite challenging because you had cultures coming together, which is always quite difficult. Lots of diversity. That exposed us to a fuller range of banking services and ultimately became part of the Standard Bank group. But it was very interesting, and one learned a lot about people, cultures, and different types of situations.
Yeah. I'm curious, how would you say your approach to leading has shifted over these years? I mean, we understand that leadership is not necessarily static, and it evolves with experiences, challenges, different people that we meet. Has there been a specific person or individual that's been instrumental in shaping your leadership style? And how would you say that philosophy has changed?
It certainly has changed. I'll talk about 3 ways it has changed. I think the first is I've become a more empathetic leader. I mean, when I first started out, I didn't really understand that I was dealing with human beings with emotions, and I had to learn that you have to first connect with the person, before you can lead that person. And, through feedback, and sort of just being intentional, I have improved over the years. I still have work to do, but, I'm a much more empathetic leader now than I was before. I think the second area I have matured in is just the understanding of how important governance is, as a leader, and making sure that you always, you keep to policies, you ensure that things are done in accordance with the rules, because governance ultimately protects everybody. And, you find out that most of the banking failures, even post during the global financial crisis, a lot of them were due to governance failures. And just making sure that everybody understands that. And I tell people, if you don't like the policy, let's change it. We are not going to avoid it. And so that's one thing that has been a core part of my leadership approach. And the last one is really engagement. I've learned to engage with clients, competitors, colleagues, regulators, shareholders, absolutely everybody. Because, I mean, you need to have these networks before a crisis hits. It's not during a crisis that you start looking for phone numbers or trying to find out who to call. You have to have those relationships and those networks that you can work. So engagement is the third area. And I've had great bosses throughout my career, Mr. Peterside, who started Stanbic IBTC, Mr. Jacko Marie, he was the chief executive of Standard Bank at the time of the merger, Ben Kruger, Sim Shabalala, who's the current chief executive of Standard Bank. All of them with very unique leadership styles, but they've all helped to shape my own leadership approach.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Empathy, governance, and engagement, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit. What I'd love to unpack is, I'm sure through all of this you have encountered, and you've touched on it a little bit, but you were forced to deal with a lot of failure. I love this quote from MLK, which states, "The ultimate measure of a man or woman is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands in challenges and controversy." And so, curious to hear what are some significant challenges or failures that you've had to endure, and also what sort of resilience methods, or when you're faced with this, what do you fall back to in order to get through it?
Yeah, gosh, lots of challenges. I think the primary challenge has been a regulatory one, which has shown up in various ways. You've got regulators that come up with rules that are contrary to international best practice, or regulators that have concerns about security. So data security, they don't want data in the cloud. Or regulators that don't want particular nationals to, or they want to keep key roles for their own nationals. And even if they don't have the skill sets locally, they are reluctant to have other nationals come in. But we found out that engaging with the regulators is the only way, trying to address the concerns they have, coming up with solutions that they find acceptable. I mean, one main challenge that I faced when I was the chief executive in Nigeria was when the Financial Reporting Council, and this was public, they sanctioned our bank basically they disagreed with the way that we reported technological transfer agreement in our accounts, basically saying that it was incorrect. And we disagreed because we had followed IFRS. They sanctioned us, a fine of $5 million. They removed my signing powers and the chairman of the audit committee to actually sign our accounts. And we took them to court because we felt we were right. And it was a 2-year plus battle, you know. But throughout that whole period, we had to engage, you know. So, I mean, I traveled engaging with ministers, with regulators, the stock exchange, also with the FRC themselves, just trying to find a way forward. And I think what really helped us was the fact that we had the right team around us in terms of lawyers, advisors. Our board was united. It was quite clear what our position was. The auditors were also very clear on that. And obviously there was huge reputational risk. We had to also make sure that in terms of anything that we put out there, from managing the PR, was important. I mean, ultimately, we arrived at an out-of-court solution, a settlement that was acceptable to both parties. But it was a very difficult time, which, you know, your clients were asking questions, you know, regulators were asking questions, you know, but we had to go that way because the worst thing you can do is, I think, back down, you know, when it's very clear that you're doing the right thing. And ultimately, the regulator did actually amend their regulations, but it was a very difficult time.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important lesson to draw, I think, from across the board, whether you're a student, entrepreneur, working in corporate. It's in difficult moments, it's often really easy to shy and get small and want to hide and hope that the problem goes away. And as MBAs, the term stakeholder engagement or management is like, you know, it sits on a paper, but what does it really mean? And so it's great to hear how just that constant engaging with the topic, with the individuals is really important in order to get through these moments. And then your second point around the team, I think we'll, again, with the entrepreneurs in the room, we'll probably really understand like the importance of, in bad times, that's when the team really comes through. And so that's phenomenal. If you can maybe go to the governance perspective, curious, you've obviously had an illustrious career within the financial services sector. What are still some of the key policy gaps that you still think African leaders still need to implement in order to make things more attractive from an investment landscape?
Yes, I think the number one thing is a sound and consistent economic policies. You know, that's what investors want to see. You know, that you're taking the right steps that would, you know, lead to a stable macroeconomic environment. So low inflation, stable exchange rates, you know, good debt management. You know, I was online yesterday and listened to Alain talking about sovereign debt. And investors want to see that you have a grip on all those things and you're working, you know, in the right direction. What they hate is the uncertainty that comes from decisions that are taken either on a whim or on a personalized basis, because then it doesn't create a level playing field and they don't know what to expect. So consistent, sound economic policies is what investors are looking for. And you have, you know, countries who are doing that. You know, Côte d'Ivoire is doing quite well. You know, low single digits inflation, stable exchange rate, GDP at about 6%. The same with Uganda, Tanzania. So there are countries that are moving in the right direction. Yeah.
And so switching topic a little bit, I'd love to go to understanding about these stories that shape Africa's perception. As I think it's an important element of that any leader is challenged with, these prevailing stories and narratives that still remain, yet, you know, we constantly have to fight to advocate for a more nuanced understanding of where we come from. And And it can always feel like Western media is portraying us in like two real dichotomous sort of portrayals, either of a vast war-torn nation of corrupt leaders or vast Serengeti on the other side. And how would you say this representation of Africa affects the global perceptions of Africa, and how would you say, as African leaders, we can shift this narrative around our countries?
Yeah, very important. I mean, the kind of narratives you get really around, immigration or conflict, war, military coups, or debt defaults. And all those things really don't help to drive growth and development in Africa. I think that African leaders must learn to communicate more. They don't communicate enough. I mean, if you compare that to, Western leaders who are always in the press, always telling you what they're doing, why they're doing it, trying to justify their positions on a whole range of things. So African leaders need to communicate more, not just leave it to, other spokesmen to do so, and need to craft the narratives that are relevant to driving growth and development on the continent. So if you take, climate change and the environment, for instance, very important, and it's important for Africa to keep to the rules, but there must also be space for a just transition. Okay, and that narrative and how it is shaped and how it affects investments into the continent is very important. Actually, President Museveni of Uganda, is one of the voices that you hear about that, just given some of the projects they are undertaking in their country. But you need more leaders, African leaders, coming out to shape the narrative, to make sure that it helps to influence decision-making at either multilateral levels or in international circles that will enable capital to come into the continent. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, you mentioned Museveni. I wonder, are there any other African leaders that you're seeing that are doing this particularly well, successfully?
Yes, I think President Samia Hassan in Tanzania is doing a great job in repositioning Tanzania. Since she took office a couple of years ago, she has changed the narrative. She talks about collaborating with her neighbors, driving infrastructure construction. She's driving the construction of a standard gauge railway that will connect Tanzania to DRC and Burundi. And it's basically saying the right things to attract capital into a country. And Tanzania is growing at, 6%, around 6% plus per annum. So I think she's a great example of a leader that is doing the right thing, and she happens to be a woman.
And so maybe going back to a topic that you mentioned in a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago that resonated quite deeply with me, which was around, I think it's easy to often look at the headlines and around the financing gap, which we know, infrastructure gap, 100 billion, climate resilience or adaptation finance gap of 40 billion, that's still required. But you stated that that finance is not the sole solution to development challenges in Africa. Though it plays a pivotal role in institutionalizing change, it's not the only factor, but it's rather about fundamentally understanding the political economy, which involves analyzing how organizational and individual power dynamics, as well as the institutions and their rules interact, and how crucial this interdependence is. And so with this context in mind, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on still what are some of the core challenges and opportunities for advancing the sustainable development, and in particular, thinking through maybe a use case that you're currently undertaking in your PhD, which is looking at the electricity sector within Nigeria, and how these dynamics are sort of playing out.
Yes, thanks for that. I'm sure everybody here is frustrated at the pace of development on our continent. I'm sure in all our countries we're frustrated. And you find that the classical sort of Weberian good governance theory has merit, but it hasn't led to the intended outcomes. And it's important that to solve a problem, you actually understand what is the problem. So, what is the root cause? Because if you don't understand the problem, you can't find the right solution. And so understanding the political economy is a very important aspect of finding the root cause. And my research, which is basically looking through a political economy lens at the electricity sector and the telecom sector privatizations, and trying to understand why policies that worked in one sector didn't work as well in another sector. Basically, is trying to understand that question. I'm using an analytical framework developed by Professor Mushtaq Khan of SOAS University of London. It's called the political settlements. And what the political settlement basically is trying to do is to understand the interplay between rules, institution rules, and also the power and influence of various organizations, whether they're political or business or societal organizations, to understand how the rules create benefits, and these benefits could be in the form of import licenses or concessions or oil blocks or some kind of benefit, and whether these benefits are reproducible, whether the benefits are sustainable, are economically sustainable in terms of, is there enough to go around for everybody? Whether they're politically sustainable so that the various stakeholders are actually happy with the share that they have. And also unpacking things like the entrepreneurial skills within a country, the productive class, what is the relationship between entrepreneurs and the ruling class. You look at industrial policy, for instance, and see, is there a real technological transfer taking place where people are learning by doing things and real capabilities are being developed to actually do things in the country? Because you find out that in many of our countries, the informal sector is pretty large, and you have a relatively small formal sector. And what that means then is that the governments are not able to generate enough revenue from formal sources, taxes, duties, etc., to distribute amongst people. So the distribution then has to take place informally. So basically understanding the political economy, the relationships, who has influence, even the regulatory environment, how effective is the regulator in enforcing rules, in monitoring rules, or do you have regulatory capture? So unpacking all of that, understanding the political economy better, you are then able to situate policies that could work in a particular area or design policies in a way that mitigates some of the risks that you see. So essentially, that's kind of the thrust of the research. And ultimately, a sector-by-sector approach, because you can't boil the ocean, as my supervisor, Dr. Pallavi Roy, always says. You can't boil the ocean. So a sector-by-sector approach in understanding the political economy is probably Africa's most effective way of driving growth and development.
Yeah, that's amazing. And are there specific tactics beyond enrolling in a PhD, which I'm sure I think a lot of MBA students here would probably have a heart attack at thinking about going through it right now. Are there specific sort of tactics or methods in which you find to be useful in order to gain this understanding and knowledge about the landscapes in which we're operating in?
I think talking to operators in the sector is invaluable. So whatever sector you want to go into, just spending time going to listen. When I was chief executive of Africa Regions, I was based in Johannesburg, but I was looking after 19 countries. And there's no amount of report that can tell you what's going on in the countries. You've got to go there yourself. You've got to talk to the people. They'll tell you things they'll never put on paper. So if you really want to understand a political environment, you have to go there and talk. You talk to the market women, talk to the business people, talk to the regulators, and you will come away with a proper understanding of how things really work, not what they say is working. It's how it really works. And then that then helps you in designing a real business strategy that is sustainable. Yeah.
No, that's very encouraging to hear. And in fact, one of the highlights, I think, for a lot of students here and why they choose to come to Said is, if I can shamelessly plug, we have a Doing Business in Africa, which invites students to come back. It's only in South Africa, it's still, so we're looking to hopefully expand that out to more countries over the years. But it is really about being on the ground, and nothing beats understanding businesses on the ground and speaking to people. And so I think I'm going to take 2 questions from the audience. I already have 2 here, and then I'll maybe just come back to you to wrap up from the perspective of, if you were sitting in the audience, what's the one message that you would want to walk away with about Africa, or if you're about to start again in your career, what vision of Africa would you want to create? You can choose one or both, and we'll finish with that. But for now, questions from the audience. We have one from Olusei Adebei. Hope I'm not butchering your name. What would you say is the role of banks in supporting infrastructure building in Africa, considering the risk of unfavorable government policies that can result in loss of revenue from debt and investment defaults?
Yeah, so banks are part of the solution, but then commercial banks typically are not going to provide more than sort of 3 to 5 year money. So you actually need a whole consortium of banks, development banks, multilaterals, funds, pension funds, all coming together. Because for infrastructure, you need long-term, low-interest money to drive infrastructure. You're not going to get, and that's part of the challenges in Africa, where you have that mismatch between the type of financing that is required and what is actually available. So commercial banks can only do so much. Many times it's even a bridge, but certainly that's why it's so important for governments to encourage long-term capital to come in, because they don't have the fiscal space to develop the infrastructure. So it has to be private capital that is coming in to drive infrastructure development on the continent. Yeah.
And as a second question from Jonathan, how can Westerners who understand Africa and its people and potential help shift this media narrative? I think it's a great question.
Well, talk about the things that matter. Talk about the things that drive growth. Talk about the things that will help support a positive narrative about Africa. Because, it's easy to just sort of give the traditional view of what Africa is, and like you say, either Serengeti or otherwise, but actually visiting and going to the countries. I mean, I found that just traveling across West, East, Southern, Central Africa opened my eyes, and until you actually travel and go and meet people, you actually don't know what to talk about. So I would encourage, as much as possible, visiting the countries and bringing out the positives, and just that effort to kind of drive capital into the country, onto the continent, I think is very important. Yeah.
And so I think the last question around, and there any specific moments, I think you touched on this a little bit, but I'll ask it anyway, were there specific moments or challenges that stand out as particularly transformative during your time as CEO?
I think the merger period, which I've spoken about already, because that, it's important, and the merger was important because it made us bigger, okay? And you will find out that many times you have to come together, businesses, either through a merger or through collaboration, to work together to create something bigger, something with more impact. So I think that whole period of transformation was very important in basically just enlarging our scope of influence and also, my own area of influence as well. Yeah.
And maybe to wrap up, back to the question of either I can repeat it again or if...
No, I know it.
Okay.
And I'll handle both of them. I think the first message is there are opportunities in Africa. There are lots of opportunities. Every challenge, every problem that you see is an opportunity for a business. So if you look at Uber, Uber is a business solution to a transport problem. M-Pesa in Kenya is a business solution to a payments problem. So every problem you see, is potentially a business solution. So I think that's something that is important to just keep in mind. So anytime we're frustrated about things, there's a solution, there's a business behind this. And I think in terms of my vision for Africa, it will be that every child has access to education. Education is a game changer. Education affects your mindset. So if every child in Africa had access to education, I think it will transform the continent. I think also every African having access to electricity. As Dr. Adeshina of the Africa Development Bank says, Africa cannot develop in the dark. I think it's also important for every African to have access to financial services, some type of financial services, and it is possible. So I think those would be my closing thoughts. And I think the very last thing is responsible, competent, and value-driven leadership across the political, business, and social space is critical to drive growth and development in Africa.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think with that, we're going to close. We've had some tremendous insights here, and I want to thank you again for making this time available to us. I think some of the leadership principles that you've shared and the stories have been really enlightening. I hope resonate deeply with all of you here, regardless of what sort of career or trajectory you're working on. I think there's definitely some principles that we can all take beyond these four walls. And so thank you for your time, and
Thank you for having me.